We have Susan Hayes, who's joining us. She's done a lot of really, really great work up at the Texas legislature, and she's always been helpful whenever we have questions. And I know that she is constantly at legislators' offices helping educate them on best practices. So I am going to spotlight your video, Susan. You are unmuted,
right,
and
thanks.
I'm going to mute myself.
Thanks, Jax, and thanks to that prior presentation about the border. That was fabulous, and I'm actually broadcasting from a border county today, where I'm hanging out during the pandemic. Well, I'm going to talk numbers because the silver lining of the pandemic and the devastation on the Texas economy may create an opportunity for Texas NORML and for advocates out there. Even before this pandemic hit, the Texas economy was already seeing some problems with the drop in the price of what's West Texas Intermediate, and that is the sort of standard measure of the price of oil in Texas, and it's an important worldwide economic figure. It was already sliding down to the $30, $20 a barrel range, and that's the range where fracking stops because it's no longer economical to do so. Today, the price of West Texas Intermediate dropped into the negative, all the way down under $1. Yeah, I see Jax's surprise. Into the sense, it was trading at negative $20 a barrel for a while today because the places to store our oil reserves have filled up. So that was happening anyway because of a pissing match between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And that on top of the COVID-19 pandemic's effect on the Texas economy means we're going to be in a world of hurt when it comes to figuring out the budget next session. And that to me means politically, we may have an opportunity to not only expand to have a real healthy medical cannabis program, but also start talking about and even have a chance of passing legalization because of how enticing that revenue may be for legislators. And let me give you an idea about Texas and the size. I mean, everybody knows we're a big state, but let's put some numbers on it. Texas has about 29 million people in it. Our census should put us over the top for 29 million. Compared to Canada, 38 million. We are 3/4 the size of Canada. A lot of the cannabis industry nationally has been running around excited about Colorado or Oklahoma. Those states only have 4 million apiece in them. We're huge, an enormous market compared to other states. From Gallup data, about 2.4 million Texans consumed cannabis within the previous year, according to 2018 numbers. 1.3 million Texans consumed cannabis, and these are Texans over the age of 18, within the last month. That's a big market. And with that market can come some serious tax revenue. And we'll compare and contrast that with the Teacup program. The Teacup program had less than 1,000 patients in it before this last session. Now with the tiny little increases in who can participate in Teacup, even though they can't get any measurable THC over 0.5%, that's edged over 1,000. That's really pathetic for a medical cannabis program. In states with a healthy medical cannabis program, comprehensive, about 3% of the population signs up for it. All right. Representative Moody talked about criminal justice costs a little bit, and he put the figure about $7.75 billion in savings if we quit prosecuting for cannabis statewide. Right now, there are about 68, or I say right now, leading into the 2019 session, that previous fiscal year, there are about 68,000 marijuana possession charges, misdemeanor charges, meaning a smaller amount in Texas. That accounts for 1/3 of the county court cases in the state of Texas, 1/3. If that goes away, that's an enormous savings, not only to states, but particularly to counties. And our local governments are going to be in a world of hurt too, because of the pandemic. So as y'all are out there advocating, don't just stop at talking about your state legislators. Your county commissioners might be interested in that cost savings as well, because they're the ones having to pay for the criminal defense costs, the jail cost, all the other associated criminal justice costs with marijuana criminalization. Potential revenue, seen a couple of models out there. Y'all heard from Sean Hauser earlier today. Her firm who has a full-time economist on staff because they're that great, did some calculations looking at other states like Massachusetts and Colorado and extrapolating to the size of Texas And they came up with about $500 million roughly in revenue per year in tax dollars if we were to legalize marijuana. I ran some numbers based on Nevada, which is sort of not a great model because they have the tourism influx to their purchases. But if we taxed it like Nevada, the state of Nevada taxes, not the local add-on taxes, but just the state, I came up with a figure of $1 billion. So let's say we're between $500 million and $1 billion in tax revenue, plus that $750 million in savings of cost if we were to legalize marijuana in Texas. That's well over $1 billion, maybe even $2 billion a year that the state of Texas would save overall or have in revenue overall. Now, let's put that into perspective of our budget. The Texas budget this last biennium, so for the 2-year period, was $251 billion with a B dollars. That's a big number. But when it gets into the legislative process where they're really deciding who gets what dollars, a lot of that budget is already taken up by public schools, healthcare costs, things that they can't really move the needle on that much. What they can move the needle on or tend to be the extra healthcare for the really vulnerable people, and along with other things. And the previous speaker talked about the $800 million for the border. That was something the legislature chose to add when nobody was asking for it. And so they can come up with 800, or they could in past years, 800 million when they wanted to. But this next year, being able to offer $1 billion is a number that should turn heads, even in the context of a $250 billion budget. We have a rainy day fund. The rainy day fund is $8.58 billion. So that'll give you another sense of how to put it in perspective. It's attractive, and it's something we ought to be out there talking about it. Texas is going to need revenue. We can either have cartels and drug traffickers and some pretty nasty people out there making money, or Texas farmers can make that money. People who are unemployed and need jobs can make that money, and Texas can have the tax revenue. And speaking of unemployment, we went from 16,000 people on the rolls to, by the end of March, not even, and we know we've shot up since April, that number shot up to 276,000 people. So as bad as this pandemic is on our economy, it's creating some opportunities for us that we should talk about. And I did want to throw out something else about the hemp market as it's beginning and flourishing. I'm really worried about would it be able to flourish because of the pandemic, that people may just not be able to get out there and do their planning or have access to capital that they need to buy the equipment or whatever else. That's another big piece of that, is whether we're going to be able to sell flower in stores. There was a draft dishes rules that came out last year that purported to prohibit the retail sale of flowers. My position as a lawyer is that's not legal because it's not in the bill. The bill prohibited the manufacturing and processing of hemp consumables for smoking, but the sale of flower itself is not anything that's processed or manufactured. So all you advocates out there, get ready for dishes to publish their rules, which should happen any day now, maybe in May, maybe at the end of April, so that we do just bombard them with comments about how much that is going to cut the throat of the burgeoning hemp industry to not be able to sell high quality flower in stores. And Jax, I've sort of blown through my time super fast. Is there any questions out there about going into session?
So there were a few questions that people had submitted talking about, a lot of people are really worried about the expansion of the medical market now that they're having to shelter in place at home, and it's more difficult to access probably the black market medicine that they've been utilizing. What kind of, if you could look in your, magic fortune ball,
crystal ball, right.
And say, what you think we should be striving for, what would you advise?
I think particularly in this bizarre time we're living in, access to healthcare is going to be an even bigger issue next session. And, one thing I meant to start this talk with that I'll throw in now, when you're advocating to legislators, you got to try to get inside their head. We go in there as activists and advocates, and we're all about our world and our issue. If you know what they're thinking, then you can figure out how to pitch it to them. And if you know what they're worried about, then you can be part of the solution. And that's where we do have an opportunity with the enticement of revenue from recreational sales. And we should all be very careful to talk about we are not taxing medicine. That is just wrong to tax medicine. But recreational sales, yes, we can tax, and we should tax, and we should direct that fund to healthcare. This pandemic has really exposed how tenuous our healthcare system is, because people's healthcare is tied to their jobs. People are getting laid off from their jobs, therefore they're losing their healthcare. There's going to be a lot of talk next session about how do we fix some of these things. The medical community is already abuzz about it. And I see emails flying around among medical lobbyists or how we can do something this next session to change this and make access to healthcare better. Those who are into this issue know how much better a medicine cannabis can be than pharmaceuticals because of the lack of nasty side effects that you often get with pharmaceuticals. Getting that explanation across to people in the legislature and policymaking, or even in your county commissioners' courts, is helpful. This can be a cheaper, more accessible medicine for people instead of pharmaceuticals, instead of even over-the-counter pain relievers for some. Also talk about, I think I heard a question about reciprocity with other states. That's another issue to make people, help people understand. You know, and there have been right to travel arguments made in some of the federal litigation that's pending about the legalization of cannabis in the Southern District of New York, that patients need to have access to their medicine wherever they are. And that includes cannabis medicine, whether it's CBD or a formulation that includes THC.
And another thing that people were kind of, because you were talking about dishes is coming up and giving regulatory input. So, you know, what is virtual comments from the public going to look like? You know what I mean?
It might look just like this Zoom call. Yeah. I know, and it's, I feel for people who can't work remotely because they're in the service industry and they've just lost their jobs. And I'm really fortunate that I can. As a lawyer, I can talk to people on my computer and I can write and research. It is harder to get those we can't do the one-on-one meetings that lobbyists like to do. And that's where you can really read people's body language and figure out how to talk to them. So we're having to go back to Zoom meetings. And we also, another big picture issue we've got to think about going into the session on the cannabis issues. Everything having to do with healthcare and government is all freaked out and working on the pandemic. I'm not sure they have the bandwidth in their brains to even think about cannabis right now. You know, dishes originally wanted their rules to be finally adopted by their May meeting, and they can't make that now because of the pandemic. So the pandemic's pushing that aspect of the hemp regulation back about 6 weeks, and we hope only 6 weeks. So I think we've got to be conscious of how overwhelmed they all are, and ask for that space in their brains and in their agenda really, really, really nicely, because they do have bigger fish to fry. But at the same time, take every opportunity to educate them, whether it's through the rulemaking process with dishes or through conversations we have on political town halls with candidates. You know, you can't underestimate how little they know, and you can't underestimate how much you can teach them if you take that opportunity with the conversation.
And in that conversation, right? You know, I mean, that's a big thing about policy, is framing what your talking point is. And so coming at them in a very, you know, grace, I like to call it like acting with grace, like I'm going to preface this with a really simple explanation to tell you why I'm now asking this question, and setting them up to be able to say yes to something, hopefully, right? So making sure that we're being present in these virtual spaces is going to be a little bit more challenging, but I think that we can do it.
Absolutely. And I mean, the politics is the art of the possible. And the more we find those unlikely allies in conservative offices who a year ago didn't even dream they'd ever have to know anything about cannabis, much less advocate for it, the better. And we really do find those fellow travelers in those offices once we start talking to them. It turns out there's a staffer who has a relative with a brain injury, or a staffer who had seizures themselves. And they're curious, they're interested. And the more we can teach them, the more we can engage them, and the more we can build up that army within the Capitol to get good bills passed next session.
Yep. It's all about meeting with people and making friends. So thank you so much for chatting about some of the implications. I was very shocked to hear that clearly about the the oil pricing. So
Yeah, negative, like how does that even work?
Texas, what's happening? But thank you so much, Susan, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon.